When I accepted the job, I had no idea what to expect. I had read the descriptions, I had passed the interviews, but I never imagined that my destiny would lead me to a dark, isolated, secret-laden basement. The job wasn't difficult, or so I thought at first. I had been assigned the task of filing old company documents in a space that, I was told, had not been used for years. The basement was a place that few ever set foot in. Most employees avoided that part of the building, but not because it was off limits, but simply for the sake of comfort. The air in the basement was always colder than in the rest of the building, and a kind of constant dampness ran along the exposed brick walls, which didn't seem to have received attention in a long time. But I didn't mind. This job offered me stability, and that was all I needed at the time. The first day, I walked down the creaky metal stairs, which always gave me a strange feeling, as if something or someone was watching me from below. I reached the bottom, and there it was, a large room with shelves full of boxes stacked haphazardly. I could tell that the place had been completely forgotten. Dust covered everything, from the tables to the chairs, and the air smelled of aged wood, mixed with a metallic touch that I found disturbing. My task was simple: organize the documents in chronological order. There were folders and files of all shapes and sizes, and the labels were unclear. Many of them were dated more than 10 years ago, and others seemed to have been forgotten altogether. The first thing that caught my eye was the presence of boxes that were strangely closed, with seals that did not correspond to those of the company. The seals did not appear to be from an official provenance, and the boxes had an appearance of having been moved around in the past without much care. Instinct told me I should ignore them, but my curiosity got the better of me. I opened one of them. Inside the box, I found a series of stacked documents, most of them illegible, but among them there was something that didn't fit. A package wrapped in a cloth that looked like it belonged to another time. At first I thought it was some kind of garment or rag, but when I opened it, I found something much more disturbing: a series of black and white photographs. The images were blurry, but they all featured people I didn't recognize. They appeared to be in an industrial setting, just like the building I was working in. I couldn't help but shiver when I saw their faces, especially because they all looked too serious, even tense. Something about those photos told me something wasn't right. I kept the photos in a corner of my mind and continued with my task. The following days passed normally. I spent the hours going up and down stairs, filing documents, until one afternoon something caught my attention. While going through a box in the back of the basement, I noticed something odd on the floor. It was covered in a layer of dust, but something was sticking out between the wooden boards. I bent down to examine it better, and by moving one of the boards, I could see a crack. At first I thought it was just a crack or a leak, but upon closer inspection, I realized it was something else. A part of the floor was lifted up, as if something had been buried there. I felt a knot in my stomach, and, without thinking much about it, I took a screwdriver that was on one of the tables and started to lift the wooden boards. The sound of the boards coming off the floor echoed throughout the basement, but no one else seemed to hear it. After a few minutes of work, I managed to lift enough to see what was underneath. What I found paralyzed me. There on the floor was a small cavity, and inside it, 3 bodies. They were wrapped in black plastic, but they did not look like fresh corpses. They were in an advanced state of decomposition, and the smell of putrefaction was unbearable. My stomach rebelled at the smell, but I forced myself to take a closer look. The bodies did not appear to have been buried in a professional manner. There was no sign of a common grave, but of something improvised, as if someone had wanted to get rid of them quickly. I got a little closer and noticed that one of the bodies was holding something in his hand, something that glowed faintly in the light of the basement lamp. I couldn't help myself. I approached and took the object. It was a small medallion covered by a layer of dirt, but when I cleaned it a little, I could see that it was engraved with a symbol I didn't recognize. It was not a religious symbol, nor a company logo. It was something strange, almost esoteric, that seemed to belong to another time. With trembling hands, I put the medallion in my pocket and covered the cavity as best I could. I didn't know what to do. Should I tell anyone what I had found? Who? The company's superiors? The police? I had no idea how it had gotten there, or who these people were. But something inside me told me that I had to keep it a secret. I wasn't ready to face the consequences of finding out. I decided not to talk to anyone about what I had seen and continued with my work as if nothing had happened. But that decision weighed on me more and more. The nights became more disturbing. When I went down to the basement, I felt that something was watching me from the shadows, that the bodies under the floor were waiting for me. I could not stop thinking about them, nor about the medallion. I wondered if that symbol had some meaning, if it was related to the company, or if there was something darker behind all this. Time passed, but the weight of my discovery would not leave me alone. No one in the company seemed to know anything about what had happened in that basement, and I found myself increasingly trapped in a spiral of paranoia. I started going through the documents I had found in the boxes, looking for some clue that would help me understand what had happened. But everything seemed to indicate that those files had been forgotten, as if those responsible wanted to erase all traces of the events that had taken place there. One day, while investigating yet another box, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a report dated years earlier, telling of an accident in the building, an accident in which 3 employees had disappeared without a trace. The report didn't mention anything about the bodies in the basement, but the dates matched. Those employees had been working in the same place as me, in the basement, just prior to their disappearance. The report said nothing about what had happened to them, only that they had been reported missing and that the incident had been closed without further investigation. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a terrifying way. Those bodies buried in the basement floor had to be those of those 3 employees. What had happened to them? Why were they disposed of in that way? Who had killed them and why? I couldn't find any answers, and worst of all, no one else seemed interested in the matter. The company continued its course as if nothing had happened, and I kept working in the basement, doing the same thing every day. But every time I went downstairs, I felt the weight of the bodies under my feet, the weight of a secret that no one was supposed to know. There was a night when everything exploded. I couldn't take it anymore. The silence I had kept for so long was no longer enough to bear the burden. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the images of those bodies, of the faces of the missing employees, and I felt the cold of the cellar seeping into my bones. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, and the medallion, which I still kept in my pocket, burned me with its weight. I could no longer live with that truth. I had to do something. So I decided to go to the police. That morning, instead of going down to the basement, I left the building and went straight to the police station. When I arrived, I felt a little calmer, although still with fear in my body. I knew that telling what I had found would change my life forever, but I could no longer carry the secret. I told everything, from the forgotten basement to the discovery of the bodies. I handed them the medallion, the report, the blurry photos I had found in the boxes. They listened to me in silence, without interrupting me, while I recounted the details with a frankness that surprised myself. The police took my statement and agreed to investigate the matter immediately. No one said a word about the medallion, nor about the strange symbols. I was only asked to remain available for further questions. As I withdrew, I felt a mixture of relief and fear, as if by speaking I had opened a door I could no longer close. I don't know what happened afterwards with the investigation or if the truth behind those bodies was ever discovered. But something inside me tells me that although I am no longer in the basement, the echoes of that discovery will haunt me forever. At first, everything seemed normal. It was a quiet neighborhood, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, where time seemed to pass slowly. The kind of place where neighbors greeted each other when they passed each other, and where the days went by without any major upheavals. I had lived there for years, and like anyone else, I was comfortable in the daily routine. Work, shopping, evenings in front of the television. Nothing to disturb the order, nothing to make me question the calm that surrounded me. At least that's what I thought. It was during a particularly cold winter that I began to notice something strange. At first it was small, almost imperceptible details. A house at the end of the street that always had its curtains closed. The absolute silence that surrounded that place. The absence of any kind of movement inside. The house, of common appearance, seemed to be inhabited. But I never saw anyone. The curious thing was that the few neighbors I knew talked to me about the family living there as if they were an absent entity, as if they were not at all present in the community. None of them seemed to really know them, but they all agreed on one thing. The family in that house was strange. The first encounter occurred on a gray afternoon as I was returning home from shopping. The door of that house, which had always remained closed, was slightly ajar. A strange impulse led me to approach. At first, I thought it was something trivial, as if someone had forgotten to close it or something like that. But as I approached, I noticed a peculiar sensation in the air. The house, although it seemed empty, emanated a strange energy, an invisible pressure that immediately made me uncomfortable. I decided to leave, but something prompted me to look back, just as I saw a person peek through the door. It was a middle-aged woman with a fixed, distant gaze, watching me from the shadows. She did not react when I looked at her, nor did she move at all. She didn't seem surprised to see me, as if she knew I was there, watching. A shiver ran through my body as I walked quickly away. The feeling of being watched did not leave me all the way home. From that day on, something changed in my perception of the neighborhood. I began to notice more strange things. Neighbors who seemed to live a life of routine but at the same time avoided any real interaction. They came and went without a word, as if everything was perfectly timed. Children played in the streets, but did not come too close to the adults' houses. Smiles were forced, and conversations, if they happened at all, were limited to the bare minimum. One day, as I passed one of them, I noticed something in his eyes, an emptiness, a lack of depth, as if he wasn't really present. I began to observe the house I told you about earlier more closely. It was always quiet, but I couldn't help wondering what was going on inside. I decided to investigate further. One day, after making sure no one was around, I approached the house. The ajar door was more inviting than I could have imagined. With a mixture of curiosity and distrust, I pushed the door gently. It opened without difficulty, and I entered without a sound. The interior was spotless, almost clinical. The walls were white and cold, without any decoration or furniture that would suggest a normal life. There was only a table at the back, on which rested a few inoffensive objects, an unlit lamp, a wilted plant, a folder with tidy papers. What caught my attention, however, was a series of photos hanging on the wall, all showing the same people. A group of adults, most with impassive faces, and several children who didn't seem to have any expression of joy. The only word I could think of to describe these pictures was empty. The faces, though human, did not seem alive. It was as if they were trapped somewhere between reality and absence. At that moment, I realized that I could not stay there much longer. I quickly left the house, but something followed me. It wasn't a physical presence, but something in the air made me feel like I was being watched. As if my movements were being watched, calculated. From that day on, the feeling of discomfort intensified, but so did my need to understand what was going on. I began to investigate thoroughly. There was something very strange about the documents I had seen in the house. A series of names and addresses of people who did not appear in the public records. The papers were carefully organized, as if someone had spent a considerable amount of time compiling them. I looked for those addresses, and what I found was even more puzzling. Other buildings in the neighborhood with similar names. Other places where it seemed that everything was under control. As if was a network of empty or uninhabited houses, but whose people were somehow kept connected. I didn't realize the magnitude of what I was discovering until I met a woman who unknowingly gave me the clue I needed. I saw her one day while shopping at the local supermarket. She looked at me briefly, and something in her gaze seemed so familiar that I decided to approach. She was a middle-aged woman with a neat but overly aloof appearance. When I casually asked her if she lived in the neighborhood, her answer was evasive. However, I noticed something peculiar. She had a mark on her wrist, a small tattoo in the shape of a circle, something I had not seen before, but which seemed to be related to the people in that house. From that moment on, I began to follow her. Not obviously, of course, but observing her movements. The woman entered several houses in the neighborhood, each with a locked door and no visible windows. She always carried a shopping bag, but rarely saw other inhabitants of those houses. The people there seemed out of place, as if they were not part of normal neighborhood life. I decided to confront her, and it was in that encounter that everything made sense. The woman, upon seeing me, showed no surprise, no fear. It was as if she was waiting for someone to find out what was going on. Without a word, she invited me into her house, as if there was no reason not to. Inside, everything was identical to what I had seen in the previous house: white walls, an empty table, and an oppressive atmosphere. It was then that he explained to me, in a calm, almost clinical manner, what was going on. What he revealed to me was chilling. The cult that had taken control of the neighborhood was not just a group of people meeting in secret. It was a complex network, with tentacles reaching into every corner of the city, and their control over people was absolute. They had created a system in which its members were incapable of making their own decisions, where their lives were completely directed by a central figure, someone who held the reins of everything through mental manipulation, psychological control, and a series of rituals that kept everyone under his influence. The new members were attracted through the appearance of normality, of a quiet life, but in reality, they were all being watched, controlled, even when they thought they were making decisions for themselves. The woman showed me more documents, more photos, more names of people who, like me, had begun to discover the truth. But worst of all, when someone got too close to the truth, they simply disappeared. They were no longer seen, no longer heard. The cult had managed to infiltrate every aspect of neighborhood life. From daily interactions to the simplest decisions, everything was under its influence. The people who lived there were not free. They were trapped in an invisible web that controlled every aspect of their existence. And I, unbeknownst to me, had been on the verge of falling into that same trap. When I understood the magnitude of what I had discovered, I knew I had to leave. It was not safe to stay there, let alone continue investigating, but the fear had already left its mark on me. I left that same night, leaving the house, the neighborhood, and the cult behind. It was weeks before I could resume my normal life. But even now, as I recount this, I feel the weight of that experience. No one in the neighborhood will ever know what really happened. No one will see past the quiet facade of that place. And even though I escaped, the shadows of the cult still lurk in every corner of the city, waiting for someone else to get too close. I can never forget what I discovered. And even though time has passed, I still feel myself watching, as if somehow I never really escaped. Winter had arrived with unexpected intensity. The normally bustling city seemed frozen, covered by a thick layer of snow that never ceased to fall, plunging everything into an ominous silence. The empty streets and fogged windows offered a sense of isolation that settled in the air, as if time itself had decided to stand still. It was in this icy atmosphere that I moved into an apartment in a quiet neighborhood, removed from the urban bustle. It was not a particularly flashy place, but the rent was reasonable and the building seemed old enough to offer me a certain peace. From the first moment, I found the tranquility of the place more unsettling than relaxing. The building was practically deserted, a fact that caught my attention, although I attributed it to the season. The walls were thin, the windows often didn't close all the way, and although the heating was more than sufficient, there was a feeling of emptiness that persisted even in the hottest moments. It didn't bother me too much. What I didn't know then was that this apartment was not just a haven for someone in search of peace, but a trap, and I had been the next to fall. The first clue came to me in the form of an old newspaper clipping I happened to find while organizing some things in the hall closet. The article talked about the disappearance of a family who had lived in the apartment before me. It said that the family members, a couple with 2 young children, had disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of a struggle or an attempt to escape. The apartment had been left empty, and the police, after investigating, had found nothing to explain their disappearance. It was one of those cases that the city tried to forget quickly. The article was in poor condition, yellowed by the passage of time, and something about its contents disturbed me. Although I tried to rationalize it, the fact that this family had disappeared from the building under such mysterious circumstances left me with a strange feeling. When I spoke to the building manager, his response was evasive. He said he didn't know much about what had happened, but that the family had decided to move out quickly, without further explanation. However, the way he avoided talking about it, the tone of his voice, made me think there was something more behind those words. It wasn't just an ordinary move. Restlessness grew in me, especially during the nights when the silence of the building became heavier. I would hear strange noises in the hallways, footsteps that faded away when I tried to investigate. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but the sensations intensified. Something was not right. I began to investigate further, looking for information about other disappearances that occurred in the neighborhood, and realized that it wasn't just the previous family that had mysteriously disappeared. Several other people who had lived in the building were gone, some of them in the winter, under similar circumstances. The disappearances always had the same pattern: families moving in normally and then simply disappearing. The authorities would find nothing, and the people who left would leave almost everything behind, as if something had forced them to flee at a moment's notice. At first, I thought it was coincidence, that maybe the building attracted people with problems, but I soon realized that something much darker was going on. One night, as I was returning home, I again heard the footsteps shuffling down the hallway. This time, however, they were not just footsteps. It was as if someone or something was moving in my direction with a clear intention. The air became thick with tension. I slowly approached my apartment door, not daring to open it right away. My heart was pounding, and the thought of being watched consumed me. When I decided to enter, I felt something watching me from the shadows. Every corner of the room seemed to be permeated with a feeling of cold and emptiness. But the worst came when, as I searched the apartment for something that might explain it all, I discovered a box hidden behind an old bookshelf in the basement. It was a wooden box, locked with a heavy, rusty chain. Inside, I found photos, newspaper clippings, and several documents that confirmed what I already suspected. The disappearances were not accidental. Something was happening in that building. Something that was drawing people to their fate. The letters inside the box were from people who had lived there, describing the same thing: a dark, disturbing place with a presence that could not be understood but was always present. It was hard to believe, but I could no longer ignore it. He knew he was not alone, that he had not arrived there by chance. The building had a dark history, and it wasn't just the structure that made it up that was wrong. There was something else, something intangible, something that fed on the people who fell into its trap. I decided to leave. It was not an easy decision, but I knew I could no longer stay there. The apartment, although empty of furniture and people, was charged with a feeling I could not ignore. I called a friend, and with his help I went to get my things, leaving the place as quickly as possible. The days that followed were strange. I felt as if an invisible burden had been lifted from my shoulders, but the traces of what I had experienced continued to weigh on my mind. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the city, but I never stopped thinking about what I had experienced. I couldn't help but wonder if my escape had been the right answer, or if I had somehow left something behind, something I wasn't willing to face. Months passed, and winter turned to spring. The city at last began to thaw, and though I tried to move on with my life, the experience in that apartment never left me. The nights when the wind beat against my window, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, the shadows in which I immersed myself in that building, would never go away. Every time I saw an old building or heard a story about mysterious disappearances, I shuddered, for I knew there was something beyond what the eyes could see. Today, sitting in front of the window, watching the snow fall again, I finally dare to tell my story. I have waited a long time, but I can no longer keep this secret. What I experienced there changed me forever. It wasn't just the presence I felt in that building, nor the disappearances. It was the feeling of being trapped in a cycle I couldn't break, of being watched by something I couldn't understand. And although time has passed, that experience is still present in every corner of my memory. The apartment, empty at last, is still there, in the city. The windows broken, the doors locked. Perhaps some other tenant will move in at some point. Perhaps, like me, he will be attracted by the apparent tranquility of the place. But I know now that there is no quiet there. There is something much darker, something that cannot be explained. Today, as I watch the snow fall, I can say with certainty that that experience marked my life in an irreversible way. And although I am no longer there, the memory of what I lived through haunts me, accompanies me, like a whisper in the dark, telling me that I never really escaped from it. The rain was falling steadily that afternoon, and as always when bad weather came, I felt a heaviness in the air, as if the atmosphere was charged with something imminent. The call had been brief. The doctor's voice, calm but with a dose of restrained urgency, had informed me that my mother was in a coma after an unexpected fall on the stairs of her house. Although the news was not entirely surprising, as I knew her health had been deteriorating for years, a strange feeling ran down my spine. Something didn't fit. I took a bus to the hospital, the darkness of the afternoon growing thicker as the drops hit the window glass. I realized that for some reason I didn't understand, the thought of facing the situation made me much more uneasy than usual. There was something in the doctor's tone and his forced calmness that made me think that everything was not as simple as I was being led to believe. I never had a close relationship with my mother. Since I was a child, her presence had always been distant, almost non-existent. She was never an affectionate mother, and instead, she was more concerned with keeping up appearances of a stable life than giving me the affection that other children seemed to receive naturally. Her manner caused me to create an emotional wall, but over time I learned to live with that. Her indifference shaped me, and I shaped her. Over time, her health problems, especially those related to diabetes and hypertension, had kept me distant. I no longer visited her regularly, only when necessary. When I arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere was cold, as expected in these places. The corridors were empty, but the constant coming and going of nurses, of doctors with their tired faces, made me feel more alien to the place. The intensive care ward was at the end of a long, almost empty hallway, lit only by the softly buzzing fluorescent lights. Upon entering the room, the contrast was what struck me the most. Despite the impersonal room, with the constant beeping of the monitors, the figure of my mother lying on the bed seemed too calm, almost oblivious to everything. Her face, pale and disfigured by the scars of the passing years, contrasted with her regular breathing, as if she wasn't really there, as if her body was just another machine hooked up to wires and tubes. I looked at the machines and monitors around her, all with steady numbers, but I couldn't help but notice that something about her face didn't fit. It wasn't just her appearance, nor the silence that filled the room. There was something else, something unsettling in the expression on his face, as if he was waiting for something. I don't know how to explain it, but a strange sensation ran through my body, something I hadn't felt before. It was several hours before the doctor in charge of his case was able to see me. He explained to me the same thing he had said on the phone: a fall on the stairs, a blow to the head that had caused the coma. However, there was something on his face that I could not ignore. The way he avoided looking directly at me, the pause in his words when mentioned the details of the accident, a slight tremor in his voice that didn't match what he was saying. Throughout the next few hours, my head kept turning over those details that I couldn't get out of my head. Why hadn't her fall been more serious? The fall of an older person, with his brittle bones, should have left more marks. But there was not a bruise on her face, no sign that she had lost her balance dramatically, just that unexplained coma, a state of unconsciousness that didn't seem to be related to the kind of accident I had been told about. The next day I decided to stay longer at the hospital. not realizing that I was more concerned about unraveling the truth than about my own mother. Something told me that I should not trust the official version. I watched every little movement of the doctors, every conversation behind my back, looking for some clue, something that would tell me I was being misled. It was at that moment that something strange happened. As I watched my mother, I noticed a small scar behind her ear, a mark I had never seen before. The skin was wrinkled, as if it was the result of a surgical procedure I didn't remember. I thought maybe it had been something trivial, something that didn't deserve attention, but curiosity pushed me to investigate further. When the doctors left me alone for a few minutes, I took the opportunity to investigate further. I walked around the room looking at everything carefully. I stopped in front of a nightstand where there was a small drawer. I don't know what prompted me to open it, but I did. Inside, I found several things that at first seemed harmless. A pair of glasses, an old magazine, but among them was something that made my blood run cold. It was a receipt from a pharmacy, dated only a couple of weeks earlier. The medication listed was strange, something I didn't recognize. The prescription included several drugs that did not correspond to her usual medical history. The combination of these medications made me wonder what else my mother had been hiding. When I saw that prescription, I knew something didn't add up. I started asking more about her treatment, about any recent changes in her life, but all the doctors and nurses were evasive. At one point, the doctor who had initially spoken to me approached me and told me I needed to calm down. His tone, now visibly tense, made me feel that he was touching on a sensitive subject, one that should not be discussed with me. Another few days passed, and the obsession to find out the truth began to take over. I researched everything I could about my mother's medications, about her previous treatments, and I came across something that left me cold. The drugs she had been taking had very particular side effects, including the possibility of inducing a mild coma in vulnerable people. But what surprised me most was the fact that these drugs were not only used to treat common illnesses, but had also been used in illegal experiments in consciousness manipulation. I couldn't believe it. My mother was involved in something like this. But as my investigation progressed, the pieces fit together with macabre logic. My mother had not had an accident on the stairs. The fall had been planned. Someone had induced her coma using the drugs and left her there as just another piece in a game I didn't understand. A doctor who seemed more willing to talk confided in me that my mother had been undergoing an experimental treatment for the past few months, one that was prescribed to her at a private clinic. He did not, however, give me any further details. Why? Because my mother, in her need for money, had agreed to participate in an illegal medical testing program, something that had involved her in secret experiments and which, for some reason, had gone wrong. The fall on the stairs was not an accident, but the result of a plan to strip her of everything, put her in a coma, and silence her forever. Fear gripped me as I realized the magnitude of what was happening. My mother had been fighting for something much bigger than her health. She had been a victim. And I, as a son, had been completely oblivious to it all. The last time I saw my mother, sitting on her bed with a fixed, vacant stare, I understood that she would never be the same again. She was not simply in a coma. She was caught in a web of lies and manipulations that even I could not untangle. When I returned to the room that night, the doctor informed me that her condition had worsened. I knew she wasn't going to wake up. And for the first time in my life, I felt more distant than ever from her. What he had discovered had changed everything, but it was too late. There was something about the hospital that didn't add up. It wasn't the unusual atmosphere or the strange noises in the hallways, nor was it the smell of disinfectant that seemed to linger like a constant nightmare. It wasn't even the coming and going of nurses and doctors so mechanized and empty. What disturbed me, what I couldn't stop chewing on, was a pattern that repeated itself all too often. A series of deaths that at first seemed like isolated incidents, but which upon further review gave me an increasingly tangible sense of suspicion. The deaths were unexplained, yes, but also all too frequent. The patients came from diverse ages, backgrounds, and diagnoses, but they all agreed on one point. Their deaths had occurred in the same intensive care unit. They all seemed to have been under the same surveillance, the same doctors, the same seemingly routine surgeries. However, there was something in those reports that told me that all this was no coincidence. At first, I thought maybe they were just deaths from natural complications, medical accidents, botched procedures. After all, medicine is not without risk. But the deaths didn't seem to follow a random line. There was a pattern, something systematic, and that wasn't normal. I was hired as a private investigator to look into these cases, and from the first moment I set foot in the hospital, I knew something was deeply wrong. The first thing I did was to talk to the patient's relatives. To my surprise, not all of them seemed puzzled by what had happened. Rather, most of them seemed to have noticed something strange, although they couldn't put a name to it. Something wasn't right, but no one knew what exactly. As I talked with them, I began to discover that they all had one thing in common. Their loved ones had undergone surgical procedures prior to their deaths. However, most of those procedures did not justify the deaths that followed. There were patients who, in principle, had no indication of serious complications, yet they died shortly after undergoing surgery. As the investigation progressed, I began to notice something even more disturbing. The deaths were not accidental. The medical reports indicated strange and unusual complications: internal bleeding, sudden cardiac arrest, unwarranted pulmonary failure. Everything seemed to fit an unusual fatality, but nothing that indicated a clear explanation. As if each case was carefully designed to look like an accident so as not to arouse suspicion. I then decided to investigate the hospital's organ bank further. Although it was not my area of expertise, I had an intuition that told me that this could be the key. After a few weeks of observing and tracking the dates of the surgeries, I came across a frightening fact. Several of the patients who had died had received organ transplants, and not ordinary transplants. They were rare organs, such as hearts, lungs, and livers, but not in patients who needed them urgently. The diseases did not justify the need for such transplants. There was something strange about how these patients were selected. They were not on the transplant waiting list, but somehow they were receiving organs from unregistered donors in the systems. I decided to investigate more about the transplants, about the source of these organs. I found a tipping point. The same intensive care unit where patients died mysteriously was also where these procedures were performed. Transplants were not only infrequent, they seemed to be performed at unusual times on people who did not need them, and always without a clear diagnosis to justify such an intervention. Gradually, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The transplants were not part of an effort to save lives. No, these surgeries had a darker purpose. Patients were dying so that their organs could be harvested and sold on the black market. The hospital was involved in an organ trafficking ring, and the deaths were not accidental. They were carefully planned. These were not medical errors or unforeseen complications. No, they were systematic murders, designed to obtain what the hospital needed: fresh organs. The revelation was a direct hit to my nerves. The magnitude of what I had discovered left me speechless, but it wouldn't let me stop. I could not simply ignore what I had found. I could not let that truth be buried under the cold indifference of the medical establishment. As I continued my investigation, the details confirmed what I feared. This was not a case of negligence, but a large-scale illegal operation. Doctors, nursing staff, and even some of the hospital's management were involved in this dark trade of life and death. One night, I decided to follow one of the doctors who had played an important role in several of the cases. I saw him enter an area of the hospital that was not marked on the maps, a dark, secluded corridor at the end of which was a locked door. My instinct told me I should go after him. Something in that place told me that there I would find the evidence that would confirm my suspicions. Following him from afar, I entered the corridor without making a sound. What I saw behind that door surpassed my worst fears. It was not an operating room nor a research laboratory. It was a makeshift room where several doctors and hospital staff members were handling human organs, not surgically, as if they were research samples, but as if they were preparing them for something. Organs were carefully packaged, labeled, and shipped out of that room. There was an organized, well-oiled system of organ trafficking that was run from inside the hospital, and no one outside the operation had any idea what was going on. I backed away slowly, feeling a knot in my stomach. Indignation, fear, and disgust mingled in my head, but an even stronger feeling compelled me to act. I could no longer remain silent. I could no longer let this all go quiet. That night, as I was leaving the hospital, I did something I knew would change my life completely. I took photographs of everything I had discovered. I took copies of the medical reports that proved the irregularity of the surgeries, the transplant records, and the dates of the deaths. I had irrefutable proof, and I could no longer allow it to remain hidden. The next day, without thinking twice, I went to the police. I knocked on the door of the police station, handing over everything I had found, the photos, the documents, the testimonies. Although they seemed skeptical at first, the weight of evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Within days, a formal investigation was opened. Authorities moved in on the hospital with a force no one expected. Those involved began to be arrested, and the hospital was shut down by health authorities. The organ trafficking network operating from the heart of that institution collapsed, and several doctors, nurses, and administrators were prosecuted. As the news broke, the scandal reached unimaginable proportions. The media was quick to cover the story, and soon the truth about what was going on in that hospital became known throughout the country. Despite the pressure and danger it put on me to be the key player in exposing this corrupt system, I was relieved to see that justice was taking its course. The families of the victims were finally getting answers to their questions. And the hospital, once a symbol of hope, became a reminder of how human greed can twist the purest function of medicine. There was something in the air that morning that I couldn't identify. The breeze was cold, with a touch of humidity that was unusual for that time of year. The sun barely made it through the thick canopy of trees that covered the path into the forest, and the feeling that something was wrong ran through me from the first moment. But we were a group of friends, and we had decided to spend a weekend in nature. Get away from it all for a couple of days. We were all excited about the idea of camping in the woods, away from the city lights, with the promise of disconnecting and forgetting about everyday worries. The place we were heading to was not far away, only about 3 hours by car, a little-known area where tourism was almost nil. On the map, it seemed to be secluded, but the truth is that we didn't know much about the terrain. We only had the instructions of a friend who had been there the year before, and who had assured us that it was an ideal place to camp. The trip was quiet, but the uneasy feeling lingered in the air. As we drove along the road that led us to the camp, the houses became fewer and the trees larger, until they formed a green blanket that surrounded us completely. We arrived at the point where we were to leave the car. From there, we would walk the rest of the way. The backpacks were heavy, but we were all feeling energetic. The hike was not difficult. The trail was relatively well marked, and there were no visible obstacles. Only the sound of the wind through the branches and the crunching of dry leaves under our feet. All along the way, we found no trace of human life. In the distance, a bird was singing, and the sound of a stream running nearby accompanied us. There was not much to say. Nature was quiet, immense, oblivious to our little worries. When we arrived at the place where we planned to set up camp, the first thing I noticed was the strange silence that had settled over the forest. Suddenly, it seemed that all sounds had died down. This was not normal. In nature, there is always noise, whether it's birds singing, wind moving branches, or insects buzzing. But here, everything was quiet. Absolute silence. It was only for an instant, but it was enough for something to wake up inside me. We set up the tents without further problems. We spread out around the camp with the normal routine. We lit a campfire, took out the supplies, and started to prepare dinner. At first, everything seemed in order. The stars were shining overhead, and the air, though cold, had a refreshing quality. However, I couldn't shake that strange feeling of being watched. Although I tried to ignore it, I felt as if something was lurking in the shadows of the forest. I couldn't stop staring into the thicket where the trees formed an impenetrable curtain of darkness. Night came quickly, and soon we found ourselves around the fire, chatting and laughing, trying to distract ourselves from the uneasy feeling that hung in the air. But no matter how hard we tried to ignore it, the uncomfortable feelings persisted. One of the guys mentioned that he had heard something strange when we were setting up the tents, like a distant rustling sound. But when he looked in the direction of the sound, there was nothing. No one paid much attention to it. We all chalked it up to typical forest noises. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something wasn't right. Something was watching us. Later, as the embers of the campfire began to die down, the cold became more intense. It was then that we heard the first clear noise, a rustling sound. It was not coming from the branches or the animals. It was too heavy, as if someone or something was walking through the trees. It was not the typical sound of an animal, not even a deer or a wild boar. It was something else, something closer to a human footstep, albeit a heavy, clumsy one. We all stood in silence, looking in the direction from which the noise came. The rustling came again, this time closer. It was a dry sound, almost as if the ground beneath the dry leaves was being stepped on by something large and heavy. We looked around nervously, searching for some logical explanation. But there wasn't. No one but us had been there. We decided it was not worth investigating in the middle of the night, so we went into the tents, trying not to think about what we had just heard. However, the air was still heavy, and the silence around us was not the same. Now it seemed more oppressive, as if the forest had closed its doors and was isolating us. It was difficult to fall asleep. Every rustle, every whisper of the wind kept me alert. I wasn't used to feeling so vulnerable in the wild, but that night everything felt strange. The early morning came and the atmosphere was freezing. We didn't get much sleep. Some had woken up several times wondering if we had heard the same thing, and the others nodding nervously. As the first ray of sunlight crossed the horizon, the feeling that something was not right did not go away. There was a palpable tension in the air, something invisible stalking us. We decided it was time to turn back, to call it a day. We packed up camp quickly, not wanting to stay there a minute longer. The road back seemed longer than we remembered. The same path that had led us so easily there now seemed darker, more ominous. The silence was absolute, and the wind was not blowing as lightly as before. Only the sound of our footsteps broke the stillness. Suddenly, we heard it again. The footsteps. Something was following us. We didn't know what, but the sound was clearer, closer. At first, we thought it might be another one of the boys, one who had taken a detour on the trail, but there was no one. The footsteps did not stop. On the contrary, they were coming faster, as if someone was running towards us. The worst thing was not the sound. The worst thing was that, as we advanced, the footsteps kept up with us, without moving away, without any sign of slowing down. We were being followed. Our breath was taken away when something appeared through the trees. I barely saw it, but enough to realize that it wasn't human. At least not in the way we humans understand. A dark, thin outline. And although I couldn't see its face, its silhouette slipped through the shadows with eerie precision. He was not alone. There were more of them. From the shadows, other figures were moving toward us. They were fast, too fast. They were hunters. We ran. We ran like never before. Footsteps echoed behind us, getting closer and closer. Whatever was following us had no intention of letting us go. The shadows seemed to come alive, as if the trees themselves were moving to catch us. At first, we thought they were just some men, hunters who had strayed into the forest, but we quickly realized that these were not simple people. We didn't know what they were, but their movements were too precise, too coordinated to be human. With my heart pounding against my chest, I managed to see the exit of the forest, and with the last strength I had left, I ran towards it. But before I got there, I felt a weight on my chest. A scream, or rather a dull roar, made me stop in my tracks. I turned around, and what I saw was something I will never forget. There was one of them, a hunter, right in front of me. There was no way to escape. In his hand he held what looked like a long knife, and his face, covered by a leather mask, was absolutely silent. But in the end, it all happened too fast. Just when I thought all was lost, something burst into the air. A bang. A gunshot. The hunter fell to the ground, and the figure chasing me disappeared into the trees. I didn't know how or why, but someone had saved us. They dragged us out of the forest, and although we never knew who they were, we never stopped wondering what the hell those night hunters had been and why they had been following us. What I discovered later, as we reviewed the photos of the camp, was something I will never forget. In each of the pictures, the trees in the distance showed a figure, a fuzzy outline that seemed to be watching us. We were being stalked from the beginning. I had been watching the house for weeks. From a distance, it looked like any other in the neighborhood. An elegant building with a manicured yard and dim lights that came on every night. But to me, that house represented the perfect opportunity. I knew the owners weren't there during the evenings, or so it seemed to me at first glance. The patterns were clear, and I had been taking careful notes, studying every move, every step. The back door was old with a lock that was easy to pick. The alarm system looked antiquated. It was almost insulting how easy it would be. The night of choice came without a hitch. It was a Friday. The weather was cold, but the night was quiet. I knew the neighborhood was sleeping soundly and there would be no one to notice my presence. I had driven by earlier, made sure there were no cameras and that the escape route was correct. The plan was made, and as always, opportunities are not to be missed. The first step was simple. I turned off the garden light to move stealthily. The back entrance was just as I had left it in my observations. No sign of activity, no indication that anything was about to go wrong. The lock gave way easily. My heart was pounding in my chest, but it was a familiar sensation, like a wave rising before it breaks. I went inside. The house was absolutely silent, like a tomb. It was dark, but that was not a problem. I had taken a flashlight with me, and without haste, I went into the main room. Everything seemed to be in order, as if the owners were never there. The decor was elegant but not ostentatious. Those houses that tell you there is money, but in a restrained way. Quickly, I looked for the master bedroom. I knew that's where the safe would be, the key to the loot. I could smell the money. The quietness of the others was my advantage. As I passed through the hallway, I noticed something strange. The house seemed to be too quiet. There was no trace of human activity, but something in the air made me feel uneasy. A feeling I had not experienced before. The noises that usually accompany an empty house, like the creak of the rafters or the rustle of the refrigerator, were absent. The house seemed dead, as if it had no life at all. I reached the room. The door was closed, but unlocked. The flashlight illuminated the room from top to bottom. Antique furniture, a couple of unlit lamps, and a Persian rug in the center. The safe was right where I expected it to be, at the back, almost hidden in a wooden cabinet. I approached cautiously, bending down to work the combination. The noise of the ceiling fan was the only thing that broke the silence. However, as I was concentrating on the lock, something made me stop. It was a noise, a faint creaking sound. It wasn't coming from the hallway or from outside the house. It was something inside, a sound that seemed to come from the bowels of the house itself, something as soft as a whisper, but it cut the stillness abruptly. I stopped dead in my tracks, my fingers still on the wheel of the safe. The creaking came again, this time accompanied by a faint thump. Somehow I knew I was not alone. Sweat began to cover my forehead, though the chill of the night still lingered. I looked around, trying to hear something else, but the silence was almost unbearable. I didn't know what was going on, but the feeling that something wasn't right came over me. The walls seemed to get closer, the air thicker. Each breath became more difficult. I decided not to back out. I knew that time was of the essence, that once I took too long, the neighbors or even the police might be alerted. I must not miss the opportunity. So I turned my attention back to the lock. The turn was perfect, and the box opened with a soft whisper, almost as if inviting me to take what I wanted. Inside, fortune seemed to be smiling on me. A couple of bundles of bills, high-value jewelry, and some documents that would be useful for a money laundering. However, before I could start stuffing everything into my backpack, the sound was repeated, this time louder. Someone was in the house. My muscles tensed. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I remained calm. I couldn't lose control. I couldn't let fear cloud my senses. I got up slowly, putting everything in my backpack, but without haste. As I did so, I watched every corner, every movement around me. I watched the door, listening intently. I couldn't decide if I should leave immediately or stay to make sure I hadn't been detected. And then I heard it. A firm footstep. It wasn't a fleeting noise like the previous ones. It was clear, resonant. I reached down and grabbed the flashlight, preparing for the worst. I could almost feel the tension in the air, as if the house itself was waiting for something. My body reacted before my mind, and I slipped out of the room, moving into the hallway with the speed of an animal. The flashlight guided me in the darkness, but the footsteps seemed closer, as if they were behind me. And then, as I turned the corner, I encountered what I feared most. In front of me, in the gloom, stood a figure. Tall, with an imposing figure, standing in front of a door I had not noticed before. At first, I didn't know what to think, what to do. The flashlight fell to the floor, dimly illuminating the person's face. And then, my heart stopped. There was nothing human in that expression. It wasn't a mask, it wasn't a trick, it was something different. Something that didn't fit. The person did not move. He did not speak. He just stared at me without a single emotion. A few seconds passed, but it seemed like hours to me. I tried. I took a couple of steps back, but something made me trip over the nearby furniture. The noise I made was enough to make the figure take a step forward. That was all I needed to make a decision. I ran. I ran without looking back, without thinking of the consequences. I ran towards the exit, towards the garden, but as I reached the threshold of the back door, something stopped me. I turned around and saw again the figure. Now, she was not alone. Behind her, emerging from the shadow, I saw more people. More figures, all the same. All with the same expressionless face. Without moving a single eyebrow, without any expression. They were there, waiting for me. Suddenly, the air became heavy. The clarity I had had in my mind up to that moment disappeared. The perfect robbery became a nightmare I didn't know how to get out of. I was not dealing with normal people. It wasn't a simple robbery. The figures began to approach, but when there was no more room to retreat, something inside me awoke. The survival instinct. In a last attempt, I threw the backpack, taking advantage of the moment of confusion, and shot out into the garden towards the fence I had planned to jump. My body was full of adrenaline. I heard his footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look. The garden seemed bigger than I remembered. As I jumped over the fence, I felt the icy air cutting my face. I fell to the other side with a thud, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran with all my might, losing myself in the darkness of the neighborhood. I ran through streets and alleys until the air in my lungs burned, until fear turned to exhaustion. Only then did I stop, leaned against a wall and took a breath, trying to calm myself. The house was no longer in sight, but I couldn't forget what I had seen. I couldn't stop thinking about those faces. They were like shadows, but with something much more disturbing. Something that followed me with every step I took. But I managed to escape. I don't know how I did it. My body moved by instinct. My mind had already abandoned any trace of rationality. At some point, I had crossed the line between what I could control and what had already overtaken me. The house no longer meant anything. They no longer meant anything. I was only left with the feeling of having been very close to something much darker than I had imagined. The last time I saw her, she was sitting in the kitchen reading a book. The clock read 8:17 in the morning, and the sun was just beginning to filter through the curtains. The coffee was ready, and the house seemed quiet, as usual. Somehow that day seemed the same as all the others, but it wasn't. Not at all. I had left home to run some errands, something simple. Shopping, a quick visit to the bank, everyday chores. I returned around lunchtime, but when I arrived, I found nothing in its place. The house was empty, eerily silent. The phone, which I always left on the front table, was on the kitchen counter, turned off. At the time, I thought maybe he had gone out for a walk or was somewhere in the house. However, as I walked through the rooms, the feeling that something wasn't right came over me. He was not there. There was no sign that he had left. No sign that he had gone anywhere. No one had called. There was nothing out of the ordinary except the unexplained emptiness that had settled in the house. The first day, the confusion made me think that maybe she had just gone away for a while, as she sometimes did. to clear her mind, or visit a friend. Most of the time she did this without warning, but it was a regular behavior, not something alarming. However, when she didn't return the next day, I began to worry. I called the closest friends, checked to see if anyone had seen or heard from her. No one knew anything. As soon as the police began to investigate, I was surprised at how quickly the situation became serious. I also began to notice strange details. Not only had she disappeared without a trace, but something in my surroundings began to make me doubt reality. I had begun to see the house as a different place, as if something was slowly changing. The bed was unmade in a way I couldn't remember. There was more dust in the corners of the room. The air felt different. And there was something in the air, a slight buzzing, as if the house itself was watching me. The police found nothing in the searches. No one had seen her leave, nor were there any traces to indicate that she had left the house of her own free will. The search continued, but weeks passed without significant progress. There was no sign of her anywhere. At first, logic told me that there must be some kind of explanation. Perhaps she had been in an accident and someone had found her. Maybe she had left with someone without warning. But as the days passed, the anxiety turned into something darker. One night, while reviewing the documents related to the disappearance, something caught my attention. In the police file, my wife's name had been spelled incorrectly. It wasn't a big difference, but I was sure it hadn't been that way before. At first, I thought it was a mistake, something insignificant, but the same doubt began to creep into my mind. Was I remembering wrong? I stopped to think. I went through the photos, the papers, the accounts we shared, the emails. Everything seemed in order, but something didn't add up. In the following days, the feeling of being watched grew. The house seemed to be full of details I did not recognize. Objects were not where I remembered them. A cup that used to be in the cupboard appeared on the dining room table, so subtly that I almost missed it. The television, which we used to leave off, was on at night. The refrigerator, which had been tidy, now had products I didn't remember buying. It all seemed to be part of a routine that was no longer mine, but I still tried to rationalize it. Somewhere along the line, perhaps without realizing it, things had started to fall apart. The people around me also began to act strangely. A close friend who had always spoken openly to me avoided me. When I met him, he wouldn't talk about it. He would just give me a forced smile and quickly change the conversation. On one occasion, I saw an acquaintance of his in a store, and when I asked him about her, he was silent for a long time. At the end, he mumbled something about how things change, but that phrase didn't fit with anything that had happened. I began to think that maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I wasn't well. Maybe the lack of sleep and the stress of the search were messing with my mind. But the idea that my wife had simply disappeared without a trace seemed unacceptable to me. I couldn't accept that that was all that was left of her. Something else had to be going on. I decided to check everything again, this time more carefully, looking for some clue, something that would point me to a logical explanation. I opened the closet where we kept the clothes. Everything seemed to be in its place. However, at the back, behind some shirts, I found a box. It was a small box, covering part of the floor, and although it was partially hidden, I didn't remember seeing it before. I opened it slowly. Inside, I found some letters, photographs, and other personal items. But what puzzled me most were the pictures. There were pictures of her, but there were also pictures of people I didn't recognize, and some of the photos looked retouched, as if they had been digitally altered to add details I didn't remember. I felt a shiver run through my body. I began to look for more objects in the house, feeling that something was not right, but each time I found more and more strange details. In emails, messages that were once normal now seemed empty to me, as if they had been written by someone different. I checked the bank, the bills, the joint accounts. Everything looked correct, but there was something subtly odd about each document. Not only were they small mistakes, but everything felt fake. That's when the police contacted me again. They had found something. They had found something in his phone records, but it wasn't what I expected. The records indicated that she hadn't made any calls since her disappearance. She had sent no messages and had no activity on her social networks. But most disconcerting was the fact that there was no trace of her prior to her disappearance. No interaction on the web, no trace of her presence in the digital world. I began to think that maybe I had never existed. Maybe I had created that person in my mind. Maybe, somehow, my mind had fabricated a whole life with her, and unable to bear the thought of being alone, I had invented her. The evidence was against me, but the doubt was stronger. Was I losing my mind? Was I the one who had disappeared instead of her? The truth came a month later. It was a cold afternoon when I returned home from a session with the therapist. I had made the decision to sell the house and move somewhere else, hoping to find peace in some corner of the world. But when I opened the door, I found something on the dining room table. It was an envelope that hadn't been there before. Inside, I found a letter written in my own handwriting. The paper was yellowed and crumpled as if it had been stored for years. At first, I didn't understand anything. The letter said, "I know you've noticed. She never existed. It was me who took care of you, who loved you. And now you are free." At that moment, everything clicked. The face of the woman who had been in my life for so long, the conversations, the memories, they were all constructions. It had been me who had created her, who had brought her into existence, but now it had all fallen apart. She never existed, and I never knew it. The letter concluded with a final sentence, a warning that chilled my blood. "You will never be free again." We had been a close-knit group for years. Every weekend, without fail, we would gather at each other's homes, and the hours would slip by with laughter, shared stories, and plans that never came to fruition. The summer days seemed endless, and the nights always stretched until dawn. It didn't matter what was going on in our lives outside of those encounters. We would always return, as if time had never moved on. But everything changed one autumn. Fog crept in between the neighborhood streets, and the air became thick, as if something was simmering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come to light. The killings began in the nearby town. A man here, a woman there. At first, the police could not connect them, but the details piled up one after another, until it became impossible to ignore them. They were always lone victims, people who disappeared out of nowhere, and when their bodies were found, there were no clear signs of a struggle. Only the cold touch of death, the feeling that someone had been there, watching, waiting. What concerned us all was not so much the manner in which the crimes happened, but the proximity. On a couple of occasions, the victims were people we knew or who frequented the same bars and cafes. In the small community in which we lived, the faces were repeated, and news of those deaths infiltrated our conversations, overshadowing everything else. No one said it out loud, but there was something in the air, a buzz in our nerves, a restlessness that kept us on alert without knowing why. It was one particularly cold night when things started to change for us. After weeks of rumors, whispers, and disturbing social media notifications, one of our own started behaving strangely. It was nothing obvious, nothing that could be pointed out right away. But there was something in his eyes, something in his attitude, something in the way he avoided conversations when the subject of the murders came up. Something I couldn't help but notice. The atmosphere became tense. The house, which used to be filled with lively chatter and laughter, now felt like a cold, empty space, despite the lights on and the music playing in the background. Each of us seemed aware of the discomfort, though none of us mentioned it. Conversations went around in circles, always coming back to the same point: the killer, the city, the police, the victims. But there was something else, something stalking us from within. I began to look at each member of the group with an intensity I had never felt before. I had been friends with everyone for years, but I had never observed them so closely. The gestures, the fleeting glances, the overly controlled movements, something was out of place. One night, after a long evening, I stayed behind. It was late, very late, and most of them had already left, tired from the day and the alcohol. There were only a few of us left in the living room, drowsily chatting. I saw him out of the corner of my eye, standing near the window looking out. It wasn't a strange act in itself, but something about the way he was doing it made me uncomfortable. His eyes, fixed, as if he was searching for something or someone in the dark, as if he was waiting for the fog to reveal something hidden. I moved closer, unnoticed by him. I stood watching from the corner of the room, trying to stay out of her field of vision. I could hear her breathing, deep and regular, but something about it didn't sound natural. It was as if she was waiting for a perfect moment to act, to do something she had already planned. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a pressure in my chest, as if I was witnessing something I shouldn't have. That's when I saw it, in his pocket. A flash of metal, something small and dark, but enough for my mind to associate it with a knife. I paused for a moment, wondering if it was just an illusion, but no. I had seen it clearly. It could have been anything, a screwdriver, a keyring, but it was not. The steel, the glow in the dark, it was a knife. At first I thought of confronting him, of approaching him and asking casually, but my body didn't respond. I felt a mixture of disbelief and terror. How could it be? How could someone in our group be involved in something so macabre? And yet every little detail was beginning to fit into a puzzle that was becoming increasingly difficult for me to ignore. As the days went by, a sense of distrust took hold of us. No one was saying anything, but we were all aware that something was not right. Conversations became shorter, silences longer. We met less often, as if we were afraid to be together. The friendship was slowly crumbling, with nothing we could do about it. No one else had seen what I saw, but we were all beginning to feel that same discomfort, that same invisible pressure surrounding us. One night, a few days after the knife incident, I saw him once again. This time he was not alone. He had arrived later than usual, and the rest of us were already in the room. I could see how he avoided looking at the others, how his eyes darted nervously from side to side, as if he knew something was about to happen. I felt the weight of the situation like never before. We all knew, though we didn't talk about it, that something was wrong, and I couldn't ignore what my gut was screaming at me. One of us was the killer. The news came more and more frequently. Another death, another one, each one with the same pattern, the same coldness. The police seemed to make no progress, and the city began to fall into a state of paranoia that affected us all. No one wanted to walk the streets alone, and the bars were emptying earlier and earlier. People began to look around, wondering if their own friends might be guilty. One night, the tension reached its peak. The 6 of us gathered in the house. There was no laughter, no jokes, just furtive glances, heavy silences. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, about the constant feeling that one of us might be next. The atmosphere was charged, the air thick and cold, as if everything was waiting for the moment to explode. It was then that something happened, a small movement, almost imperceptible. One of them got up from the chair and started walking towards the door. It was not a normal movement. It was not a casual action. It was as if he had made a decision, as if he knew something was going to happen. No one spoke, no one moved, but we all knew. At that moment, the truth was so close I could almost taste it in the air. When the door closed behind him, the rest of us were silent. We didn't know what to do. The feeling of claustrophobia was unbearable, as if we were caught in a trap. No one could get out. No one could escape. I knew what I had to do, but I was paralyzed by fear. And then something changed. At that moment, as we all looked at the closed door, someone else stood up. I didn't see him. I didn't feel him. But I knew. The man who had been among us for so long was not, and what he did next was the last thing I was able to witness before terror took complete hold of me. The police found the body 2 days later. No one knew how or why. The only thing that was clear was that the killer was no stranger. He was among us, and always had been.